Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a rainy Friday night. This turnout is stunning. I think we're actually out of seats, which is remarkable. My name is Anton Fedyash, and I'm the director of the Carmel Institute of Russian Culture and History here at American University, and this is our 7th annual symposium. If you open your programs, which were on your seats, you'll see a list of our previous events starting in 2012, and the remarkable speakers we've had. We're certainly maintaining that level today because we've got a panel of superstars of history. And as you can tell by the image, we're also partnering with the Russian-American Science Association of America. So this is the 7th year that we're doing this. And just a few very quick words about what the Carmel Institute does, although most of you know this already, of course. It was founded by Susan Carmel in 2011 as the Initiative for Russian Culture, and then became the Institute. And to put it very briefly, the whole point of the Institute is to introduce American students to the magnificence and the richness of Russian culture and Russian history. And over the past 7 years of our operations, we have allowed American students to go and travel and study in Russia, and did the same for Russian students to come and study in the United States, in addition to the events that we undertake. And none of this would be possible without Susan Carmel's generosity. So Susan, would you please stand up for a second to be acknowledged and thanked for the wonderful work that you're doing. Thank you. There are several kids here who have received the Institute's grants to travel to study, and so it's great to see those guys here. Today, the subject is, of course, the First World War, and we're getting to the end of the 4-year anniversary, of course. We at AU take this seriously. If you've been across the street on our quad, there are trenches. A lot of earth has been moved. My students practice their assault on grammar every week in their short papers. We know about warfare at this university. But it's also, of course, a very, very serious subject because the Institute was founded with the assumption that stereotypes need to be overcome and that thinking in those terms is not constructive. And the fundamental assumption that underlies the Institute's work is that dialogue is not a sign of weakness or appeasement. It is a sign of national self-confidence and an intelligent foreign policy for all sides involved. And so we work with students to open their eyes to an absolutely fascinating part of the world. We're dealing with a very interesting subject today. We've got great scholars who are specialists in their field. We're going to have short presentations from each one of them, and then the bulk of the evening for a Q&A where you'll be able to ask questions. You'll hear about historical debates, especially for the students. Please don't hesitate to ask questions because we're here for you. There will be microphones set up. They are set up in the back of the room for the question and answer period. Now, I have to recognize several people who are here today. First of all, Dean Starr of the College of Arts and Sciences, my boss. Best dean west of the Elbe River, and I'm tenured, so he knows I mean it. So also members of our board, Ambassador Lucky Roosevelt, Jim Symington. I lost you for there he is. Very interesting people here today, and now it is my pleasure to introduce a special guest, His Excellency Ambassador Antonov of the Russian Federation, who has taken time out of his busy schedule to join us. Mr. Ambassador, please.
Dear friends, these weeks the whole world celebrates the 100th anniversary of the end of the World War I. which became a tragedy of a truly global scale. 38 out of 59 independent countries of the time were involved in it. For the first time in history of mankind, casualties were estimated in millions. The war's end marked a new era in the development of the world system. Russia, over many centuries, supported strong and trusting relations between countries. This was the case on the verge of the World War I too, when Russia did everything it could to convince Europe to find a peaceful and bloodless solution to the conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. But Russia's calls went unheeded, and our country had no choice but to rise to the challenge, defend a brotherly Slavic people, and protect our own country and people from the foreign threat. Russia stayed true to its duties as an ally, suffering the highest casualty among all members of the Triple Entente. The Russian offensives in Prussia and Galicia upset the adversary's plan and made it possible for our allies to hold the front and defend Paris. The enemy was forced to turn its attention and direct a large part of its forces to the east, where Russian regiments put up the fiercest struggle possible. Russia withstood the attack and then was able to launch an offensive. The Brest-Litovsk offensive became famous throughout the whole world. I would like to note that over the recent years, our country has taken greater interest in the events of those years. Discussions are still not dying down. August 1st, the day when the war was declared against Russia, was included in 2012 in the list of official commemorative dates of the Day of Remembrance of the Russian warriors and perished in World War I. 2014 became a breakthrough year in this regard, as it was marked by a variety of initiatives commemorating the anniversary of the beginning of the Great War. On August 1st, Russian President Vladimir Putin unveiled a monument to the heroes of the World War I at the Memorial Mountain in Moscow. In his speech, he noted the importance of restoring links in the time, continuity of the Russian history, in which the heroes of that war are finally getting their deserved place of honor. An exhibition, Look into the Eyes of War, was opened in Moscow during the same time. The same year, the Russian Defense Ministry started to work on a website in memory of the heroes of the Great War of 1914-1918, which now provides public access to unique archives of historical documents. The battles of the First World War ended 100 years ago. Its lessons, however, are still relevant today. The humanity should accept the single great truth, and violence only breeds violence. The road to peace and prosperity is only possible through dialogue and mutual consent. That is why it is important to discuss and analyze the historical period. I would like to extend my gratitude to the Carmel Institute of Russian Culture and History, as well as to the Russian-American Science Associations for organizing today's symposium. I am confident that its participants will uncover previously unknown pages in history and take a fresh look at the well-known events of that era. I wish everybody productive work. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Alexander Kabanov, where are you? There you go. Of UNC Chapel Hill is the president-elect of Rasa America, so a few very short words from him. He is a professor of, is it pharmacy or pharmacology, by the way? correctly?
I'm professor of pharmaceutical sciences.
Ah, now this is a man you might want to know, especially if you're students.
You know,
Never.
scientists, they use napkins to write down their thoughts. So, well, it's my tremendous pleasure to be here today in this distinguished institute and in this crowd in this conference. We are co-sponsoring this conference together. I represent Russian-speaking or Russian-speaking American Science Association. This is an association of Russian-speaking scientists from all over former Soviet Union who now work in the United States. The association is an American organization, but it is also a founding member of a more global Russia, which is in Europe and also in Asian Pacific region and now in Japan. Now, why scientists get together? Well, for professional reasons and also for cultural reasons. So every year we have a conference in different cities. It's probably the third time in Washington. And during this conference we get together, we have scientific discussions in all sciences. It's a Russian tradition, a university Russian tradition to talk to each other about subjects which we don't know well. And we do that very well. Now, the organization is 10 years in existence, but it continues a very long tradition of Russian scientist associations. One specific feature of Russian culture and Russian scientific culture is that over a period of 100 years, Russia was essentially bleeding some of its best and brightest and sending them or they were just voluntarily leaving Russia or involuntarily leaving Russia and contributing to global culture and bringing the tradition. United States is not an exception. When we look and when we started looking at the history of Russian scientists or scientists of Russian origin working in the United States, we realized that that was a long-term cultural and scientific impact into United States. It refers to television, it refers to oil, gasoline, rubber production. It's all areas of science. And when we look at the past, we really connect to the past. And currently, we have quite mighty population of former Soviet scientists and Russian scientists working here. So I invite you to our annual conference, which will be held tomorrow in George Washington University, Metro Foggy Bottom. That's what I needed to write down because I couldn't figure out. In Science and Engineering Hall. We're going to have scientific meetings. We also will have a very special event. Every year for already 3 years, we award the Gamov Prize. George Gamov is a famous American scientist of Russian origin. For some of you who may know Russian science, he was a friend of Landau. He immigrated or defected, essentially, to United States, and he was quite a presence here in science. So this year, 2 American scientists, one from NIH, Evgeny Kunin, and another is from Stanford, Andrei Linde, were awarded the Gamov Prize. So I invite you to attend if you can spare some of the Saturday. Welcome, and once again, I wish you a very happy symposium today. Thank you.
All right, and without further ado, you have the biographies of our speakers in your program, so I will not go into great detail. Let me just begin. We are going to go in the order of the program. So my colleague and friend and the person responsible for putting this spectacular panel together, he's an expert on World War I and questions of nationalities, Eric Lohr. Come on up. I'll leave that for you. Down button for the switching.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Right away. Let's have a picture. Wait. There we go. All right. So 100 years ago, on November 11, at 11 a.m., the armistice was declared. 11/11. It was the 9/11 before 9/11. That date was chosen so that no one would ever forget. The armistice anniversary became Veterans Day, and a time to remember the dead and to promise to do everything possible to never allow war on that terrible scale to ever happen again. Now, World War I has loomed quite large in American consciousness, even though the event really did, compared to other powers, was of much smaller significance. 117,000 American soldiers died in the war, which is 0.13% of the population. By comparison, France lost 3% of its population. So did Germany. Russia lost 2 million people, about 1% of its population, 8 times more as a percent of population than the United States. And in the Russian case, the war was, I would argue, and I have argued in a couple books I've written on World War I, that war was the primary cause of revolution and civil war in Russia that together claimed about 10 million deaths by the early 1920s. So it was enormously significant, World War I, in the history of Russia. Yet World War I has not been commemorated in Russia until very recently. In the early 1990s, when I was in Moscow researching World War I in the archives, I joined the Moscow Association for the Study of World War I, and the first meeting I went to, the order of business was, well, shall we create the first significant monument to the First World War in Russia? Well, Russia's come quite a long ways on that score, as Ambassador Antonov mentioned. There have been numerous conferences, lots of publications, newly opened monuments, and there's been a lot of progress. But still, World War I in the Russian consciousness is still not seen as a defining moment in the history of the country and anywhere comparable to the way it is in France, in French history, in British history, and even in American history. Now, the armistice, which we start with, was the definitive end of the war on the Western Front in terms of combat. It was a decisive end. On the Eastern Front, for most countries, there was no such decisive end. And I'll talk more about that, but I can't resist throwing in one little tidbit that people often forget. You know what the biggest killer in World War I was? The flu, right? So World War I, even on the Western Front, didn't really end in 1918. The great flu epidemic of 1919 killed 100 million people. That is 6 times more than the total deaths during World War I itself. So its ramifications were multiple in every part, in every way imaginable. But Russia left the war in a dramatically different fashion from the sort of classic single day of armistice when all fell quiet on the Western Front. Its armistice came, in a sense, a year earlier, in November 1917, when the Bolsheviks unilaterally stopped fighting. But the Russian armistice did not lead to peace. Germany took huge territories after the ceasefire, dictated a very punitive peace, and the country went immediately from total war to even more violent total civil war. Russia really did not have an armistice. And I'll give just a 5-minute sketch of something I've written a couple books about. But the story of how Russia left the war. So, first, in February 1917, Russia had a liberal revolution. There were street protests over food shortages, factory shutdowns due to fuel shortages, and a completely botched overreaction by the Tsar, who ordered the Petrograd garrison troops to fire on the crowds in the streets. After the shooting, there were some shootings initially, but very quickly, many of these soldiers decided to disobey orders. There's a scene here from the soldiers on the streets, Petrograd garrison in revolt. And there's the Tsar, who decided to step down when his generals wrote him a polite note saying that all the generals agree that you should step down. That's called a coup in some cases, but that was part of the February Revolution. But the key moment in the revolution was when these soldiers decided not to follow orders and shoot into the crowds, which, by the way, had a large proportion of women, because most men were off at the front, and a lot of women came to work in the factories in the capital cities. So you know what the penalty for mutiny is, right? Where did it go? Oh no, did I lose my... Oh, I lost my picture. There was a picture of someone about to be shot for mutiny. But I guess it fell out of my collection here. It's death. So 200,000 soldiers rebelling in the capital city suddenly had a very strong interest in seeing the revolution succeed. And that was one of the key moments. So this was the February Revolution in short. But it was not a revolution for withdrawal from the war initially. In fact, the generals who wrote this telegram to the Tsar asking him to step down argued that it would be in the best interest of Russia to have a legitimate and popular democratic government that could inspire the populace to fight harder for either victory or at least strong defense. And many of the leaders who took over, all the leaders of the major parties in the Duma, the parliament, agreed with this general notion. And the leader who arose after the February Revolution, Alexander Kerensky, became the leader of the government and was a very strong proponent of this view. He explicitly referred to the French Revolution and the idea that a popular government could actually inspire greater fighting. And he made such a gamble on this notion that in June of 1917, he launched a major offensive. Some of the, here he is at the front. He did a famous tour of the front trying to inspire the troops to fight hard for the new democratic freedoms that they had. The US, French and British governments pushed really hard for Russia to launch this offensive. In retrospect, one of the greatest diplomatic blunders of all time, because the offensive failed very quickly. There was a general notion in France and in Russia and in many places that by 1916, 1917 in the war, that defense of the homeland is legitimate, but launching senseless offensives is not. And Russia was not the only country where soldiers went on strike against offensives, but they did so on a massive scale in 1917. Soldiers by the hundreds of thousands began to leave the front, simply desert the army and go back home. Still, the great majority of the 10 million soldiers at the front stayed at the front and were mostly willing to take a defensive position, but certainly would never go on the offensive again. So as the summer progressed, German troops took Riga and began to threaten the capital city, Petrograd, by August and September of 1917. Now in this context, the army was unwilling to send troops from the front in order to restore order in the capital. I should say that through the course of 1917, there was a wave of crime and violence in the streets of Petersburg, in part because the police were dismantled by the new revolutionary regime, and there was no real force of order in the capital city. The army, the Petrograd garrison, had traditionally been called out to suppress disorders, but it had gone over to the revolutionary side itself. And so one of the generals at the front, a fellow named Kornilov, General Kornilov, sent some troops in to restore order in the capital. And there was miscommunications between him and the leader of the government, Kerensky, and it all came to the fact that Kerensky ordered these troops to be arrested, Kornilov to be arrested, and in order to defend the capital, he released radical Red Guard soldiers from prison. They had been arrested in an attempted uprising in July, and asked them to defend the capital. So, all of this is a long way of saying that when Lenin and Trotsky conducted their coup d'etat in October 1917, there were no forces of order to call. The Kerensky-Kornilov affair meant that none of the army officers at the front were willing to support this government. And they also felt that leaving the front with the Germans so close to the capital would be a dangerous venture anyway. The police were, for the most part, dismantled. And there was nobody really to defend against the coup. So the coup was successful, and the very first act that Lenin declared was two decrees, a decree on land and a decree on peace. And the two go together in a very important way. The decree on land basically said to all the peasants in the country, it's okay to go and seize the land from the landlords, from the church, from the state, from any private individual owners of land. The decree on peace basically said the war is over. We unilaterally declare that we are no longer fighting the war. The result immediately was that millions of soldiers began to leave the front and often with their weapons went to the villages to participate in the great redistribution of lands, the great sort of absorption of all privately owned lands into communes, group ownership on the village level of lands in the countryside. For many peasants, this was the best peace that they could have imagined. There was a long-term goal of many peasants to have what was called a great repartition, a great division up of all of the lands that were privately owned, and distribution of all these lands to those who had the natural right to till it, the peasants themselves. and it ended the war. So for them, this was basically what came to be known as the Great Agrarian Revolution, something the Bolsheviks supported and gained a great deal of support almost immediately from that. But what about peace? The theme today is armistice. Well, it takes two sides to come to a peace agreement, and the Germans really weren't willing to accept the terms on which Russia declared it was leaving the war. We'll hear more about that from the world's leading expert on this process, Borislav Sheriff, who wrote his dissertation here at American University and recently came out with a major book on the Brest-Litovsk peace agreement and treaty and negotiations leading up to that. So we'll hear about that in a moment. I'd just like to conclude in a couple of things. One is that Russia really did not have its own armistice day. Its end of the war was directly linked to civil war as soldiers left the field to seize land from nobles. No other political party was willing to endorse violent revolution during the war because they feared that the Germans would use the chaos to seize more Russian territory, and that is exactly what happened. When all the dust settled and a formal treaty was signed in March 1918, Russia lost a third of its population and industrial base and was reduced to the boundaries of the early 17th century. But more importantly, there was no end to the fighting. The Bolsheviks launched a civil war that claimed 10 million lives, 5 times more than Russia had lost in World War I. So in Russia, World War I did not really end, and Russia did not have its own armistice. Thank you.
Eric, thank you. Next up, while I move through the slides to get us back, is Borislav Sheriff. There he is. As Eric mentioned, he is a graduate of American University, our history department. He finished in 2013. He's since taught at Newcastle, among other places. His book, called Twilight of Empire, if I remember correctly, Brest-Litovsk Conference, and the Remaking of Eastern and Central Europe, correct? University of Toronto last year, 2017. Rush out and buy it after this conference is over. Borislav, the floor is yours.
Hit the down arrow.
I've only got a couple of slides here.
Right, well, good evening, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank my esteemed colleagues and friends, Anton Fedyashin and Eric Law, for inviting me to be back in DC for the first time in 5 years, for what's very much a homecoming for me. And of course, you can count on the Carmel Institute to set up wonderful events, cultural events and symposia, both here on campus and at the Russian Embassy. So I'd very much urge you to attend as many of these as you can. I certainly did that while I was living in DC. So I'll pick up where Eric Law left with the Decree on Peace, of course penned by Lenin and released on the 8th of November, new style. By the way, I'm sure you all know why it's called the October Revolution, because Russia was, of course, using the old Julian as opposed to the Gregorian calendar, which is 13 days behind the calendar, so it's actually on the 7th of November. So on the 8th of November, Lenin releases the Decree on Peace, basically urging all the belligerents to come to bring this horrible war to an end. Now, the Russians, of course, are part of the Entente, fighting the Central Powers. The Central Powers being primarily Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. So the Russians are saying, Bolsheviks saying, well, come and we want to have a peace conference. The Central Powers eventually do agree. There is an actual armistice signed on the 15th of December 1917 at Brest-Litovsk. By the way, this today is simply called the city of Brest. It's located in western Belarus on the border with Poland. And the reason why the armistice and the subsequent conference were held there was because the German High Command, having captured this strategic Russian fortress before the war, they captured it in 1915 and was located on 2 rivers, and sort of that's why they set up shop there. They were very afraid of Bolshevik propaganda and the effect that it might have on the armies of the Central Powers. Again, bread, land, and peace was perhaps the most important slogan that the Bolsheviks had used between February and October 1917 in Russia, and it certainly gained them a lot of supporters because, of course, the population of the Russian, the former Russian Empire by this point, was war-weary, as were German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers as well. Of course, there's another reason on a more sort of theoretical level. Lenin in particular argued that World War I was an imperialist war, basically being fought for the redistribution of the world. So the Germans want to take over the colonies of the British want to destroy the German fleet, so on and so forth. Of course, the Russian Empire had been an imperial power, but now the newly socialist Russian Republic had no imperial ambition, so why would it want to be part of an imperialist war? So no more of that. The idea was to transform the World War into a series of civil wars, which would then promote world revolution, which became the main goal of the new Bolshevik government in Petrograd, and in particular, sort of the main aim of the Russian delegation during the Brest-Litovsk Peace Conference with the Central Powers, again, which took place between December 1917 and March 1918, when, as Eric mentioned, the second peace treaty of the conference with Russia specifically, first one with Ukraine, signed a month earlier, was signed, the 3rd of March 1918 to be specific. Now, what is world revolution? Of course, the idea, going back to the writings of Karl Marx, was that, and ultimately, capitalism would be succeeded by socialism across the entire globe, ultimately communism as the final stage of human development and the end of history. Now, more specifically, Leon Trotsky, who became People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, so basically the equivalent of the Secretary of State, the United States, or the Foreign Secretary in the UK, Foreign Minister in most of the rest of the world. Now, he was actually a very big fan of the idea, an important theorist of it, in a book written as early as 1905, he called The Permanent Revolution. He wrote, quote, "The socialist revolution begins on the national arena, it unfolds on the international arena, and is completed on the world arena." So very neatly, obviously, the Bolshevik revolution in Russia represents the socialist revolution on the national arena, and he was hoping to take it to the next level, the international arena, ultimately the world arena, at Brest-Litovsk. Thinking, how would we do that? I mean, for those of you who study international relations, obviously, or political science, you probably know that most peace conferences were held, and still are, to the extent that there are peace conferences, behind closed doors. But precisely because Lenin and Trotsky wanted to spread world revolution, they made it a precondition that if you don't do that, we won't come to the negotiating table, that the proceedings be kept open. What that meant specifically is both sides, right, the Russians keep notes in Russian, the Germans or the Austrians keep notes in German. They compare them, make sure they're the same, basically. Then release them to the world press, and they're published in the Washington Post, in the London Times, in Vienna, in Berlin, in Rome, everywhere, pretty much. And you can actually read them. They're freely available online, courtesy of the government printing office. So you can just Google Proceedings of the Brest-Litovsk Peace Conference, GPO 1918, it'll pop up as a PDF. And you can read it, including the text of the eventual treaties. So once they convene, Trotsky as leader of the Russian delegation, and before that, his basic person who stood in for him when Trotsky was back in Petrograd, a man by the name of Adolf Yeffe, basically made no secret of the fact. When Yeffe first met the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister on the 22nd of December 1917, he said, "Well, very nice to meet you. I hope that we may be able to spread the revolution to your country too." This being a sort of a person who was named Count Oskar Czernin, von und zu Chudenitz, a Bohemian aristocrat whose family went back to the 14th century, one of the oldest and most noble of Bohemian and Austrian noble families. So he was absolutely shocked reporting back to Vienna. He was like, what are these people talking about? Utopian revolutionaries. And of course, Trotsky in particular very masterfully argued that try to portray the Central Powers as these rapacious annexationists. They want to take over, again, a third of Russia's territory, Poland, Lithuania, parts of Ukraine, as well as much of Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, you name it. They want it. And this is very skillful. Trotsky was a wonderful orator, and again, this is again being reported, so people are actually reading it very importantly. And as negotiations stall, I mean, his idea was, while doing this, sort of delivering these rhetorical flourishes, to stall negotiations, make sure they don't discuss actual specifics, basically saying, and again, quotes, what diplomatic work are we up to have? I will issue a few revolutionary proclamations to the peoples of the world and then shut up shop. Again, world revolution will occur. Now, we know it didn't, but actually what I'd like to say a few words about in the next couple of minutes is how it very nearly did, and how people don't actually realize that. And that was with the so-called Great January Strike, which broke out in Austria-Hungary in the middle of January 1918. The term in Austrian-German, for those of you who speak it, der große Jännerstreik. So basically you have this news coming in from Brest-Litovsk that, you know, the Russian delegation, the Bolshevik Russian delegation, is offering, you know, a peace without annexations and indemnities, and the Central Powers are saying we can't have any more of that. Now there's a blockade, right? The British Navy is blockading Germany and Austria-Hungary, making sure that no food from outside these countries can come in, and no Argentine or Canadian wheat, for example. And so there's starvation. And on the 14th of January, as it happens, because of this very poor provisioning situation, the Austrian government in Vienna says that we're going to halve the already very meager food ration. And the combination of these food problems and, of course, the news coming in from Brest-Litovsk results in a spontaneous strike. Breaks out in the small industrial center of Wiener Neustadt here, located roughly 35 miles south of Vienna. Very quickly spreads to Vienna, of course, the imperial capital. And by the 19th and 20th of January, basically less than a week after this outbreak of the strike, 750,000 workers in Habsburg Central Europe basically lay down their tools, mostly including very important armaments industries, miners, a lot of women actually, very similar to events in Petrograd roughly a year earlier. The importance of female participation in these strikes that Eric also pointed out. So a lot of similarities there. What was going on in Petrograd a year earlier. So everybody from the Habsburg Emperor all the way down to basically the newspapers, and also the leadership of the Social Democratic Party saying, well, we have a genuine revolutionary situation on our hands, and we're going to have socialist revolution if we don't sign peace in Brest-Litovsk. Now, eventually they are able to basically negotiate the first peace treaty of the First World War with the newly proclaimed Ukrainian People's Republic, and that to a certain extent, and the willingness, again, of the Habsburg authorities, the government in Vienna mostly, to negotiate with these moderate leaders of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, ensures that there is no repeat of in this one would have been a January revolution on the model of Russia a year earlier. Now, again, things come very close to genuine revolutionary takeover. The strike actually spreads from Austria to Hungary. I've highlighted the main industrial centers which were affected. In Germany, by the 31st of December, there are 1 million people on strike, so more than in all of Austria-Hungary. And Germany is very important for Lenin in particular. Why? Because it's the most industrialized state in all of Europe, second only to the United States in the world in terms of industrial output by 1913. So the idea is again to extend world revolution first to Central Europe, so Germany and Austria-Hungary, then ideally to Britain, France, the United States, so on and so forth, until we have a global communist order and the end of history, so the state shall wither away, as Karl Marx ultimately wrote. And again, there are several reasons that I won't go into that have to do with the specifics of social democratic parties in Central Europe, why the leaders of the Austrian Social Democratic Party and the German one don't actually support a revolutionary seizure of power in Vienna, Budapest, and Berlin on the Bolshevik model. But, in other words, there was no Austrian Lenin in January 1918 urging the Social Democratic Party and its armed Red Guards to storm the Schönbrunn Palace, the equivalent of the Winter Palace in Petrograd, although Soviets, well, they're called Soviets sometimes, the German term is basically workers' councils, but they're based on the Bolshevik, the Russian model. There's councils of workers and soldiers mostly, and they're set up. The most famous one, of course, is in Vienna, the capital, but there are others all across the empire, but again, no Austrian Lenin. So at the end of the day, the Central Powers do negotiate a peace treaty with Ukraine, then basically renew their advance on the Eastern Front when Trotsky says, we leave the conference, we're going to sign a peace. It's known as the No War, No Peace Declaration. The Germans then advance further to the east into additional Russian territories and forcing thereby the Russian delegation to return to Brest-Litovsk and ultimately sign the second treaty on the 3rd of March. So it seems like sort of the world revolution failed, right? But that certainly did not discourage the Bolshevik government from pursuing it, and even though ultimately it was superseded by Stalin's idea of socialism in one country after the early 1920s, again, as Lenin's health declined precipitously from December 1922 until his death in January 1924, basically there's a struggle for power with Trotsky and Stalin being the two foremost proponents, and of course, in part because world revolution is so much associated with Trotsky, Stalin develops the idea of socialism in one country. In other words, the idea behind that, very simply, is that the Soviet Union, after December 1922, can and will construct a socialist society on its own, and then ultimately that will sort of serve as a shining example for the rest of the world, which will follow. But there's a Communist International, known as Comintern, set up in May 1990 that basically aims to coordinate communist parties abroad, spring up in Germany, Austria, the United States, Britain, and ultimately work towards world revolution at some point. And this very utopian dream, if you think about it, of world revolution, never really dies until the very last days of the Soviet Union's existence, and it forms a very important part of the story of 1918 and its ultimate implications for the next 80 years. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. I'm keeping track of time. Excellent. Next, Elizabeth Wood, specialist on female power. 1997 book, I believe, The Baba and the Commissar, one of the best things written about the role of women in this fascinating period. So, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
So, welcome everybody. First, my thanks to Eric and Anton and the Carmel Center and the ambassador and everyone from Rasa for coming to hear this talk. We've been given a difficult task, 10 minutes, to do a big topic. I'm going to talk about women in war, peace, and revolution. First, I want to just start with an immediate segue from my colleagues to say World War I is an anniversary that's hard to celebrate. It's a war of carnage, trench warfare, no clear moral story, the good guys and the bad guys, no patriotic. It's hard to make heroes, muddled beginnings, muddled fighting, muddled endings. It doesn't end, as Eric so eloquently said, because it flows right into the Civil War. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't study it, because in terms of gender, we're talking changing gender demographics, populations, gender relations, and ultimately gender policies. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. Some of it you may know, but some of it you may find surprising. On the one hand, it would appear that war does not have a woman's face, as Svetlana Alexievich said, "У войны не женское лицо." And yet, as Alexievich herself beautifully shows, of course, war has many womanly faces. And in fact, the fact of women's participation in the war greatly affects the outcomes after the war. So I'm going to say a little bit about the war and then a little bit about the outcomes. So obviously on one level, men were at war, men were away. That affects every household. Women in the cities were struggling with inflation, rising prices, bread shortages, fuel shortages that affected not only the industry, but even their own housing. People were burning the chairs in their house to try to stay warm. Women were also working in the war industries. Overall, nationwide, women went from 26% of the industrial workforce in 1913 to 43% of the workforce in 1917. It's a gigantic jump in a very short period of time. Of course, they were only making 30 to 50% of the wages that men were making, but that's a different story. Although that also is affecting the issue of radicalization, right? The long lines for bread, the sense of struggles, the lack of rations for soldiers' wives. Soldatsky played a big role in the upcoming revolution, questioning who is this war for? Who's making money off of this war? A question I think we should always ask when we see our governments going to war. Where's the money in this? But women were also serving in the war. In particular, toward the end of the war, the provisional government created the Women's Battalions of Death, as they were called, all female soldiers battalions designed to shame men into fighting. That was the whole idea. There were women serving in the medical professions, which meant not only just some nice tying some bandages, but being at the front lines, dealing with blood and gore. And for our purposes of thinking about this as a revolutionary moment, it matters also that women were in all of the political parties. They were in the most radical parties, but they were also in the most moderate parties. They were in the Social Democrats, the Bolsheviks, the Social Democratic Mensheviks, they were in the SRs, they were in the cadets. Don't think there were very many women activists among the monarchists. But they were agitators, organizers, party, union activists, writers, delegates, journalists, playing a lot of roles at multiple levels. And then, of course, as historians know well, but maybe many of you are scientists, you don't know, women played a key role February 23rd, the first day of the real revolution, the February Revolution that brings down the Tsar. It's women who take to the streets with signs demanding bread, demanding better rations for the soldiers' wives, but also demanding the vote. This was March 8th. This was the International Women's Day. Most people in this audience actually come from Russian backgrounds. You know, March, was moje Mart. Marta is just, you know, sacred. When does that holiday get its start? February 23rd. I have a whole article actually on the ways in which the early Bolshevik government did not want to celebrate the February Revolution. They get rid of the February Revolution, and so what do they put on 23rd of February? Dzień Krasnej Armii, the day of the Red Army, the day of men. This is actually a 1960s, making it Men's Day, but it is a 1920 holiday to, I think, not celebrate the February Revolution, which is about the toppling of the monarchy, and it's not about bringing the Bolsheviks power. But that's another story. The story I want to talk about today is, what does it mean that on February 23rd you have an all-class women's revolution, women's going out, you have women from the nobility, who are demanding the vote, you have women from the working class who are in the factories, who are leaving their factories, calling out the men to join them, you have women from the universities, you have women from even the households, all aspects of women. They come out in the streets, they demand the vote, and by March of 1917, they've got the vote. Russia gives women the vote before almost any other countries. Finland had the vote before, but it wasn't an independent country. It was part of the Russian Empire. New Zealand has given women the vote. A few states in the United States have given women the vote. But it's really, Russia is the first major country in the world to give women the vote. By July 20th, 1917, women over 20 received the right to vote and to hold public office. This becomes critical after October 1917, because the Bolsheviks, again, something not well known, except very well known among historians, the Bolsheviks come to power saying they are still going to hold elections to the Constituent Assembly, which was supposed to be an assembly that would decide everything, even how the government would be organized. Of course, it's true that the Bolsheviks very quickly got rid of the Constituent Assembly. But nonetheless, throughout the fall, you have campaigns to get women to vote. And so it matters how women are voting and what women are saying, and the Bolsheviks in particular are trying to reach all different women to get them to vote, of course, for the Bolshevik Party. So we think of the Bolsheviks as this radical party, but I would argue that in many ways, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were acting like an electoral party. They wanted it from 1913, when women got the vote in the factories, till 1917, when women are getting national vote. Now you need women's votes, right? But the other thing that's very interesting about the revolutionary moment is the incredible riches of the early Bolshevik legislation. And so I want to say 2 words about that. The Bolsheviks come to power in October 1917, and immediately they pass the decree on land, bread, land and peace, and a few other key things, the Cheka, etc. By 1918, they're putting in their first law codes. By 1922, they've got a family code, and in each of these codes, they put in a huge set of laws that some of which seem perfectly normal now, but were extremely radical for the time, and some of which have even fallen by the waysides, and Russia was a leader. It's very, very important to remember Russia was a leader. They were doing this for a couple of reasons. One is they genuinely, I believe, wanted to emancipate women. This was a socialist project. But another reason was they wanted to undermine the church. The family was a church matter, as it is in many countries, where the religious authorities handle family matters, and secular authorities handle so-called public matters. Here, the church was responsible. You couldn't get a separation even from your husband without the church. Bolsheviks want to undermine the power of the church, so you give women equality in marriage and equality in divorce. This is very radical for Russia. You had to go through incredible hoops before the revolution just to get divorced, right? So now you have civil marriage, the ZAKS, the famous, you went to the ZAKS. You have civil marriage. Men and women could take each other's last names. You have divorce. You have legitimacy for illegitimate children, which kind of gets lost in 1944, but that's also another story. Again, we can take these things up in the Q&A if you're interested. But that's very forward-looking. You have the legalization of abortion on medical grounds. The fear was that if women were having backstreet abortions, they would die. They knew this. They knew the medicine of it. They were very concerned. They didn't like the idea of abortion, but they thought it was absolutely vastly better than, we have all the documents on it, vastly better than the alternative. Women in the land code of 1922, women were returned the private plots which the Stolypin reforms had taken away from them, and they were declared to be equal members of the household with the right to participate in the village assembly. Women were given the special women's section of the party. Homosexuality was decriminalized, but one of the ones I want to especially point to that I think is really interesting was they had a law on sexual harassment that today would still look revolutionary. The quote from the Criminal Code of 1926 says, "Compulsion of a woman to enter into a sexual liaison by a person in relation to whom the woman is materially or professionally dependent is punishable by deprivation of freedom for up to 5 years." Me Too in 1917, right? Me Too in 1926. It was also, you couldn't force a woman into prostitution, what we would call sex trafficking. You couldn't, you could be punished for spreading VD. They were extremely worried about syphilis and gonorrhea. You could, that affected both men and women. You could be punished for statutory rape and, of course, rape itself. So we see that in this moment of revolutionary upheaval, women gained many things that we sort of take for granted. Divorce seems like a normal thing, right? It was not. It was a groundbreaking thing, and yet there were other ways that women. There was still a deeper ambivalence about gender that is a whole other subject of portraying women as synonymous with the backwardness of the nation. So the infant mortality. Another project I'm working on is about posters and how do you portray forward men and women in relationship to the backwardness of the illiteracy, infant mortality, and so on. But this legislation was really radical, and I think it's in part because of the demographics of the war, the post-war situation, the revolutionary situation, and so lots to think about and talk about more.
Elizabeth, thank you. Spectacular stuff. Hang on, let me redo this. Okay, David Engerman, I forgot to mention that Elizabeth Wood is from MIT, so sorry. And now we'll hear from Yale. Author of 2 spectacular books on the Soviet Union, Modernization from the Other Shore, and Know Thy Enemy, and just had a new one come out called The Price of Aid. David Engerman.
Thanks. I'm honored to be a part of the Carmel Institute event. I think it really provides a model for all of us in the way it focuses on teaching on the one hand and on the power of Russian culture and history on the other. I also have the difficult task, as we come toward the end of the speakers, of trying not to repeat what's come on before, but I'll take my best stop with this. 1918 marked the real steps toward the consolidation of Bolshevik power in Russia, but also a new effort to expand the horizons of revolution beyond Russia's borders, imagining a new world system, as Ambassador Antonov had it. That year, along with the 2 following ones, revealed patterns, I'll suggest, that would dominate for 3/4 of a century of Soviet rule and would have a profound effect all over the world. In this brief time available to me, I'd like to emphasize 2 points about the Bolsheviks' international vision. First, Bolshevism was, in practice as in theory, international, about fomenting global revolution. But what that actually meant turned out to be open to interpretation, and indeed the scope of Bolshevik internationalism was frequently in flux. Secondly, the dreams of global revolution had a life of their own. They would have effects far beyond, and indeed far different from, Bolshevik intentions. From the very start, Bolshevism was this international endeavor. It came by its internationalism via Marxist theory, which envisioned communism as the ultimate successor to capitalism. Just as capitalism was global in scope, so too would be the revolution that overthrew it. In 1918, the Communist Manifesto was celebrating its 70th birthday, though showed little indication that it was ready for a retirement party and the proverbial engraved watch. The manifesto had declared proletariat of all countries unite. We've already heard about Trotsky and his theory of permanent revolution. We can also add Lenin in this. In the throes of the Great War, Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, outlined the theoretical case for communism as the international movement of its day. It did so in the wreckage of the Second Socialist International, which was very international until the war started, and then it was broke into nationalist parties, just as the guns of August saw action in 1914. But it wasn't just Bolshevik theory, either inherited or invented, that looked beyond Russia's borders. Even as the new regime expended most of its efforts on defending the revolution in Russia, it also looked beyond. And here's, I think, where the story gets especially interesting. In December 1917, only weeks after seizing power, Lenin and Stalin issued an appeal to Muslims of Russia and the East, trying to incite revolution in that vaguely defined East, here meaning actually mostly South, parts of Central Asia that had been part of the Russian Empire, as well as the region from Afghanistan through British India. Yet the call to arms reveals perhaps a little too much about Bolshevik hopes. Yes, it was international, but for domestic purposes. Noting a series of anti-imperial protests in Ireland and Egypt, for instance, the appeal noted even in far-off India was there rebellion happening. Right? India here was less a place than a concept full of passivity and fatalism. Lenin and Stalin pointed to the Indian revolt not so much for its potential results as for trying to goad Central Asians into following suit. Central Asians, this appeal went, should live out their revolutionary dreams by coming to the aid of the Bolsheviks, still then, of course, under grave threat from counter-revolutionary forces in Europe. To the extent that the earliest Bolshevik policies actually looked beyond the former Russian Empire, they kept their eyes resolutely, as we've heard, on Central Europe. In early 19, some 2 months after the Bolshevik seizure of power, Lenin declared, "There can be no doubt that the socialist revolution in Europe must take place and will take place." With equal parts scientific prediction and desperate hope, he insisted that all of our hopes for a final victory of socialism are grounded on this conviction. In 1917 and 18, then, Bolshevik internationalism was more about what it meant for Russia and, by extension, even for Europe. It would soon enough expand, but this expansion, too, was intermittent, contested, and stutter-step. Actually had a great deal to do with the high hopes and unfortunate fate of revolution in Central Europe, which seemed so promising in 1918 and collapsed so miserably soon thereafter. Just as important as this broadening field of vision, though, were ways in which the Bolshevik Revolution offered resources, mostly ideological, but occasionally logistical or even financial, to revolutionaries elsewhere. The events of 1918, which this symposium acknowledges, offers an important clue about the sites of global revolution among committed Marxists in Russia. The year is filled with European turmoil amid the end stages of the war. The sparks of revolution lit up Europe, in keeping with a Marxist vision that saw industrial workers, the vaunted proletariat, as the motive forces in history. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty of March 1918, about which Dr. Chernev has spoken so expertly, gave Bolsheviks some breathing space, which they hope to use to blow the winds of revolution back into Germany. Nor did they intend to use only their breath. Even with the intense fiscal pressures at home, Bolshevik leadership authorized 2 million rubles, 1/5 of its foreign affairs budget, to spread communism abroad. At first, the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs acted as a surrogate international, with Trotsky at the lead. But by May 1918, it established a federation of foreign groups within the Russian Communist Party. In October of 1918, they set up a so-called Little International, focused on aiding communism in Ukraine, the Baltics, and Finland, what we might call the near abroad of its day. These attentions and funds arrived in a Central Europe already roiled in political ferment in 1918 and 19, with revolutions declared in Berlin and key locales across Germany, most of which were short-lived, from Hamburg near the North Sea to Bavaria in the south. German communists, led by Rosa Luxemburg, invoked the Bolsheviks with establishing workers' councils, again taking their name from workers' Soviets in Russia. In nearby Budapest, the People's Republic quickly gave way to a Soviet republic, and indeed groups of radical militia traveled the countryside known as the Lenin Boys, which sounds more actually like a country music group or perhaps a Beatles tribute band to me. Yet as central revolutions faded at the start of 1919, the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg in January, the fall of communist rule in Hungary, Bolsheviks' attentions and their hopes turned elsewhere. This was evident in the early work of the Communist International, the Comintern, created in 1919 in Moscow. The inaugural Congress revealed the stark contrast between grand visions of global revolution and the realities of radical politics in the the immediate aftermath of World War I. The Comintern was supposed to represent a parliament of radical forces around the world, but got off, I would say, to a slow start. The first Congress in March 1919 brought together a motley group of 50-odd delegates, some significantly odder than others. About 30 of the delegates were from territories that had, until the recent war, been part of the Russian Empire. Another 18 were from Europe. There were 2 from America, actually one from each side of a brewing socialist schism. Only 3 delegates came from beyond the North Atlantic, and none of these were full delegates, only consultative ones. The world, so far as these proponents of world revolution went, was Europe. To the extent that these early discussions in the Comintern even contemplated the non-European world, they did so almost exclusively in terms of Europe. Revolution in the East, the logic went, could serve the true revolution happening in Europe. Leon Trotsky thus incorporated colonies into his plans for igniting England and France. The road to Paris and London, he said famously, ran through the villages of Afghanistan, the Punjab, and Bengal. What we might call dialectical geography was hardly Trotsky's alone. Even his future nemesis, Stalin, agreed. But the East was soon enough wrapped up in Bolsheviks' hope for Europe. Bolshevik enthusiasm for revolution in Europe's Asian colonies grew in inverse proportion to their hopes for revolutionary movements in Europe itself. As the Hungarian Soviet and the Spartacists of Germany left the scene in paroxysms of violence, anti-colonial activities in India and Egypt suddenly seemed more promising. Yet this newfound attention to revolution in the colonies offered an opportunity for nationalists there to prove their own relevance to the dream of global revolution. Take, for instance, Manabendra Nath Bhattacharya, a Bengali nationalist better known, thankfully in streamlined form, as M.N. Roy. Devoted to freeing his India from British rule, Roy took a doggedly international perspective on his cause. He spent World War I traveling around Asia trying to convince German diplomats to support his cause. Anyone opposed to the British Empire, he believed, could be an ally of his. Roy's travels eventually took him to Stanford, where he met his future wife, and to New York, where he learned his Marxism behind the New York Public Library's famous lions. Soon enough, he ventured southward to help create the Communist Party of Mexico in 1919, which he then represented at the Second Comintern Congress in 1920. A Bengali who learned German radical thought in New York, applied it in Mexico City, and then brought it to Moscow. Now that's internationalism. By the time he got to Moscow for the Comintern Congress, his attention, though, was all on India. He wanted to use Moscow's ideological and organizational support, hopefully even its financial resources, to fight his own foes in India's nationalist movement. He was so convinced of the need to challenge the Indian National Congress, which he saw as a bunch of bourgeois liberals, that he famously took on Lenin himself in early Comintern confabulations. He insisted that no true communist could ever align with bourgeois nationalism. I can't quite match the sneering tone that he would have used in the colonies. Even, he said, it may seem that allying with bourgeois nationalists in the short term could be beneficial. He said it should not take place. The Comintern, for Roy, was a chance to fight his own domestic battles with overseas support. Though he outlasted Lenin, he never got the chance to prevail. By the time the Comintern implemented the kind of ideological rigidity that Roy himself desired, he'd actually already been expelled from the body. His impact in India, furthermore, was limited. Though he created the Indian Communist Party, in the mid-1920s, its internationalism could not compete with Gandhi and Nehru's Indian National Congress. Anti-colonial nationalism was the dominant, indeed, almost the sole force opposing British rule in India. This brief excursion suggests that the dynamic force was never just in Moscow. It was in these revolutionaries in India and around the world who most fervently held the dream of global revolution. As for Moscow and the Comintern, Lenin and his fellow Bolsheviks gave up on European revolution in the short term and then eventually set their sights beyond. By 1921, Lenin conceded, with some understatement, that the movement toward world communism has not been as linear as we had planned. 2 years later, just before the major stroke that would leave him incapacitated, Lenin offered an updated prediction. The outcome of the revolutionary struggle, he believed, was assured, but not by activities in Central Europe, by the massive populations of Russia, of India, of China. As Bolshevik leaders tried to reconcile their hopes of global revolution with political and military realities in Europe, their dreams changed. And as this dream of global revolution emanated from Moscow, it took different forms. Bolsheviks and their successors might, indeed did, hold total organizational control over the Comintern, but the dreams of global revolution were plural. They circulated in the minds of revolutionaries all around the world in the decades after 1918. Thanks.
All right, ladies and gents, and our fifth and final speaker, Alexei Miller from the European University at St. Petersburg. 7 monographs, hundreds of articles, a great scholar.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for introducing me as a Grafman. When you are the last to speak, what you have to do, you have to talk about something which differs from all previous topics, and that is what I'm going to do. I shall talk about memory politics and about the place of the events we are talking about in memory politics in contemporary Russia. And let me remind you that in the late Soviet Union, there were 2 foundational myths. The Great October Socialist Revolution and the victory in the Great Patriotic War. Now, when Russia was preparing to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Victory Day, a special meeting of the government was held in 2013, that is 2 years before the actual event. And a commission was formed, which was chaired by Putin himself. Now, if we look at commemorative activities preceding the centennial of the revolution, we shall find out that the decision to do something about it was taken in December 2016, that is 2 months before the February Revolution took place. And that was a pure technical decision by the government, which said practically nothing in terms of evaluation of the events, and just informed what is the funding for conferences, museum exhibitions, and publications. And that shows that the role of these two foundational myths is very different. One remains in force, the other is gone. And Russian ruling elites began to distance themselves from the legacy of the revolution as early as the 1990s, when Moscow's Red Square stopped hosting official parades. And on the 7th of November 1996, October Revolution Day was renamed the Day of Accord and Reconciliation. This focused public attention on overcoming the consequences of discord and the civil war. It should be noted that there were no attempts to turn the February Revolution into a new foundational myth, to portray this February Revolution as a positive event and link the genealogy of post-Soviet democratic Russia to this democratic revolution. In 2004, the 7th of November holiday was abolished completely. And top officials practically ignored the revolution in their official speeches. In short, the official position on the centennial of the revolution implied that this event should be marked but not celebrated. Rightly so, we have heard that 5 times more victims were caused by the revolution and civil war than by the First World War. While revolution was sinking into oblivion since 1990s, the World War I was coming back into picture. It was, during Soviet time, practically erased from the memory to extent that there was not a single cemetery in Moscow with any monuments to the people who fall fighting in the World War I. And you can imagine what cenotaphs after World War I, what is the role of these monuments in the memory politics of all European nations. And on the whole, Russia in 2017 took a fragmented, conflicting approach to commemoration of 1917 revolution. And we can distinguish at least 3 important narratives which were presented in public about these events. One belongs to Russian Orthodox Church, which is a very important player in memory politics in contemporary Russia. Another to Communist Party, and the third to Russian liberals. So if we look at the narrative of Russian Orthodox Church, it condemns the crimes of the Bolsheviks, and it also condemns the Russian Empire's revolutionary and liberal tradition, which prepares the disaster of the revolution of 1917. The role of the clergy in February Revolution, which was pretty active, by the way, is largely not mentioned. communists today claim that October 1917 was a starting point of consolidation of power and restoration of state capacity, which was destroyed by the irresponsible liberals during the February Revolution of 1917. And liberals themselves argue that the February Revolution was generally a nice thing, but it was stolen by the Bolsheviks, and that February Revolution might have led to better performance in the final stages of the First World War, which was mentioned. That was the Kerensky story. And Kerensky's story is actually interesting, very, very much interesting, because we can see how immediately after the revolution in February 1917, all the forces which play on the liberal side started absolutely coordinated campaign in shaping the cult of personality of Kerensky. So, ladies and gentlemen, it was not the Bolshevik convention. The attempt to organize the offensive in summer 1917 is probably a crucial point, and let me add some possible explanations and interpretations to this event, because it was not that fighting offensive war was illegitimate while protecting your country got legitimacy in the eyes of the soldiers. You can say that this offensive was about liberating the areas of the Russian Empire or your country which were captured by the Germans. But the very cost in human lives of active operations on the front were much higher than defensive tactic, which had some chances in 1917. When we look at correspondence of people who make decisions at that time, it is very clear that we are dealing with an effect of a cyclist. They are so afraid of losing control of the army that they believe that the only way to keep it is to prepare this offensive. So that shows that criticism of liberals for lack of responsibility in their actions is not ungrounded. Now, we ask a question whether the revolution was caused by the defeat in the war, or the defeat of the war was caused by the revolution. And here it is very clear that the collapse of the state begins, and state capacity begins in February 1917. It begins in February 1917, and I would say that the main structures which keep things going one way or another are municipal authorities, which were not destroyed by the revolution. And it is the October Revolution which destroys these municipal centers of power, which bring, and that brings country into civilizational collapse. So it is not only civil war, it is also dramatic deurbanization. It is also dramatic costs in human lives because of starvation. those ladies who were angry staying for 3 hours in the line to the bakery in February 1917, by that time probably knew the difference between the country which has some shortages but doesn't even have an all-embracing ration card system simply because it doesn't need it. The country was not starving by that time. And the situation when basically the whole country is in starvation. To wrap up, interesting things happened to the past in memory politics. And this fact that during 1917, President Putin participated in opening 3 monuments. One was the monument to the victims of communist repressions. Another was the monument to his favorite Tsar, Alexander III, in Crimea. The third was the cross, memorial cross in Kremlin on the place where Grand Duke Sergei was assassinated. And this cross was brought down with direct physical participation of Lenin. So it's all symbolic. Interestingly, the monument which had to wrap up the Centennial commemoration of the revolution, and which was supposed to show Mother Russia embracing a commissar and a white officer, never came into being, which is nice. Thank you.
All right, well, now let me ask the participants up on the onto the stage, please, for the Q&A, and we'll open it up for folks to ask questions. Ladies and gents, the microphones are in the back. If it's really tough for you to get up, climb out, you are free to shout. Or speak up, rather. Now, I do want to mention one thing because no one has mentioned it of the speakers. I wanted to show everyone this image from Life magazine from March of 1917. It accompanied a very short article about Elihu Root's visit to the country where a revolution had just happened. This is after February when the Tsar was dismissed. And look at the way that, look at the dates on Lady Liberty riding a bear into what is presumably Palace Cathedral Square in Moscow, because behind is the Cathedral of the Assumption, which is where the coronations always took place in Russian history, right? 1776 to 1917. The American reaction to the February Revolution was overwhelmingly positive. And there's a very interesting existential connection, I would argue, between what happens in Russia in February and what Wilson ends up doing to the United States when he brings it into the war. Without the February Revolution and the toppling of the Tsar, there's no way that Wilson could have argued in this town on the 2nd of April that this war that was raging at the time was a war about democracy, because the United States would have been entering a coalition with an ally that was not a full democracy. It was, it had a czar. But after the revolution, all of a sudden, this reinterpretation of Wilson's of you know, the world needing to be made safe for democracy, all of a sudden works. But it also dooms the provisional government, because American entry into the war takes off the table any hope for peace without victory. And the provisional government's decision to stay in the war is what will ultimately lay the foundation for the Bolsheviks to come to power. But then Lenin and Wilson, who both articulate their messianic globalist visions that can't coexist on the same planet in April of 1917, lay the foundation for the rest of the 20th century. It's a remarkable history. And they both thought of themselves as revisionists and revolutionaries in terms of foreign policy, because they believed that transparency was important. Long before WikiLeaks, the Bolsheviks published and cause a scandal by publishing all of the Allied documents where the French and the British and the Russians agree on territorial divisions and post-war settlements and colonial reallocation. It's an absolutely fascinating story. All right, I'm done. Questions? I see Harley, are you already at the micro? No, okay. So microphones, the floor is open. We have until 9 o'clock, so a good 20 minutes. So please ask and direct your question to any of the speakers. Please identify yourselves. Let's go.
Hi, Alexander Noma from George Mason University. So last week, Russian media reported that in the city of Vladimir, there was a poster campaign of kind of like in Victory Day, but they had portraits of veterans from the ЧК saying "Они служили в ЧК," so venerating that memory. Do you believe that, this is for anybody in the panel, that the term Chekist and Palach are synonymous? And what do you make of how a lot of the same people in Russia, like the same citizens, some politicians, is there any cognitive dissonance when they're expressing grief over the murder of the royal family, but at the same time venerating the legacy of Felix Dzerzhinsky and that service at that time?
I say that's most likely for you, but everyone, of course, is welcome to.
Okay, let's put it this way. Is Chekist something what people should be proud of? I think not. Is Chekist equal to Palach? Not necessarily. Some were not. Many were. The memory of these issues is very much fragmented and very in memory politics you never look for clear logic. You look at what is being done by which actors and in my view this attempt to somehow bring back legitimacy of ЧК and KVD, etc., is A, stupid, B, will not work. And the last thing, the last story which shows why it's not going to work is the attempt to shift the commemoration of the victims of repressions from Lubyanka Square, where it usually took place for many years, to this new Sakharov monument. And by this attempt, which failed, they did extremely stupid thing. They started the process of delegitimation of this newly created monument. I hope very much that they are not that stupid that they cannot draw lessons from what didn't work this way. So they will stop it and they will leave the institution, which is already an institution, which works, this day of commemoration at Lubyanka Square, work as it should work.
Anyone else on this? Listen, let me add very quickly what Alexei said. The Putin government today, right, has taken it's taken a very interesting approach to Russia's 20th century. Instead of choosing which side to embrace, it seems to have embraced both of them. So it's from what I've heard and seen, Putin's gone out of his way not to take sides and to consider what happened in 1917 a tragedy of global historical import, significance, and proportion. But I at least haven't seen a sort of I'm pro-white or pro-red. This is part of Russian history. They can get away from it, so it needs to be embraced and studied, but both sides at the same time. I don't know if I can say
just one addition. Putin does make it clear where he stands for that, about that. He is anti-revolutionary. And by being anti-revolutionary, he's in accord with approximately 90% of today's population of Russia. Revolution is not popular. That is clear.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got a whole line. Guys, please come up and identify yourselves quickly and brief question.
Hello, I'm Jonah Kaufman-Cohen, a student here at AU. This is a question for Professor Wood. What was the Kerensky government's attitude towards women's rights?
You have your, they're on already.
Actually, it's the Kerensky's government that gave women the vote in July of 1917. And that's part of the problem why no one has studied it until my colleague and friend Rochelle Rothschild wrote Equality and Revolution, because people said, well, it didn't matter because, after all, in the Soviet Union, they weren't real elections, they weren't really votes, so it didn't really matter that women got the vote. But in fact, I think it had all kinds of consequences, and so it was exactly the provisional government that gave women the vote.
Hi, my name is Lee Block. I'm a student here at AU Junior. I have, may I ask 2 questions?
Go for it.
Splendid. So the first question is, I'm wondering if you could trace either an intellectual or structural link from the idea of global revolution to the concept of revolution from without. Might I note my favorite term in all of world history. Lovely contradiction. Anyway, and then the other question is, I mean, it's no secret on the eve of the Great War, the autocracy was having all kinds of very, very serious institutional problems. And so I'm wondering if it was inevitable that that Tsarism would either collapse largely due to the fact that it couldn't really reform itself, just due to the concentration of power at the top. So anyway, I digress. Was the collapse of Tsarism inevitable, and did World War I just hasten that?
Eric?
No, it was not inevitable. There was a revolution that we haven't mentioned, the 1905 revolution. So the word autocracy actually doesn't apply after 1905, I would argue. That it introduced a parliament and a constitutional monarchy of sorts. I mean, it was certainly a constrained monarchy after that. So you've convinced me I need to write the article that I have in draft form, why Tsarist autocracy should not be a term that is used after 1905 to describe what has existed after 1905. So
Let me know if you need a research assistant.
Did you want to add?
Yes, if possible. First of all, was some crisis inevitable? Yes. Does this crisis mean revolution and collapse? No. It was a crisis in a country which was experiencing the early stage of economic miracle. The growth of industry was approximately 6.5% per year. The growth and transformation and structural transformation of agriculture was promising absolutely fantastic results. And there were plenty of other areas where Russia was extremely promising in terms of development. Revolution of 1905 was the only successful Russian revolution, in a sense that it was not victorious, fully victorious. It was successful enough to give push for political change, but it did not destroy the state. The biggest problem of Russian intelligentsia was they didn't understand the value of the state, or they believed that they can control the state properly, while Max Weber knew what it's all about after looking at Russia in 1905, saying that there are some cadets who really believe that they can rule this country without a monarchy. They will be the first victims. He said it in 1906.
And he was right. Let me just reinforce what I mentioned. Keep in mind that Russia goes into the First World War in 1914 as the world's fifth or sixth largest economy, depending on how you count. I mean, this was a powerhouse, and the industrialization of the late 80s, 1890s, and the early 20th century produced an enormous amount of growth and growing pains, because as we know, urbanization, rapid, the collection of large numbers of impoverished people in cities or on their outskirts is a recipe for instability. It doesn't mean the collapse of the state, but it certainly is growing pains. All European countries went through this.
But I just want to add one quick thing, though. I mean, I think it's fine that they had a constitutional monarchy, but everybody disagreed about what they wanted the state to be. So I think the fact that they didn't have a common understanding of what they wanted, what politics even was. If we think about the 1990s with the breakup of the Soviet Union, politica meant policy. They didn't have an understanding of politics as a place of figuring out how to run the government. And how to run society.
And
so
compromising
and
also.
compromise. And so the autocracy, I would still call Nicholas II an attempt at an autocracy. He wrote to his wife and said, thank God we don't have a constitutional monarchy. The autocrat on the one hand and the liberals on the other, let alone the Social Democrats, everybody hated this. The parliament was insufficient for everybody. So I think it may have been doomed even without the war.
So
I really do have to write this article.
So to the end, I'm sorry that your name is escaping me, but with the lovely blue scarf. Given that the Duma became the provisional government and it was effectively just suspended in midair without any sense of legitimacy, is there any sense that the Kerensky government even could have lasted any longer than it did?
The Kerensky government was, again, trying to please so many different masters. And at the same time, they got in trouble for not publishing their documents on foreign policy. I mean, the treaties that when Milyukov's government failed had a secret agreement with the Allies that it pulls him down. So they couldn't meet all the masters. They on the one hand wanted a democracy, but the demos, the people that they were trying to please, were absolutely fed up with the war, fed up with government, didn't think government did anything good for them. So I think it was very difficult to rule. But
Thank you all very much.
Eric, sorry.
Oh, no, not done?
Next.
Of course.
Hello, I'm Thomas Schaffner. I'm an undergrad at AU. One of the lives that has always fascinated me from this period of global revolutionary utopianism is that of John Silas Reed, the American journalist who would travel to Moscow very much believing that he was witnessing the end of history and end up dying during the mid-1920s, disillusioned with what he saw as inaction on global revolution. And this just predicates my question, which is, did the nascent Soviet Union see itself as a model, a city on a hill for revolution, or as a shepherd for revolution, as a force that would actively and materially support revolution around the globe? And if so, how?
The answer is yes, right? It was both a model. This is one of the things I meant when you're kind of coming right to it, when I said that they could all agree on internationalism, but there was not necessarily agreement on what internationalist regime would do at any one moment. So the turn to socialism in one country is part of a broader strategy that says consolidate power and then have revolution emanate from outside. But that's never completely supplants the notion that revolution will happen elsewhere. So I don't know that I think it's a distinction that works very well in theory, but it actually is a kind of contested notion throughout the whole Soviet period.
Absolutely, I would agree. I mean, in many ways, both. The city on a hill is a very good way of putting it. Again, by constructing this wonderful egalitarian, very prosperous communist society within the Soviet Union, the idea was that the workers of the rest of the world would just see how wonderful it was and overthrow their local governments. Of course, the Comintern is in existence until 1943. The middle of the Second World War, when Stalin disbands it because he's now allied with the United States and the British Empire. and so it's kind of inconvenient. But he does set up this thing called the Cominform Bureau in 1947, which basically seeks to bring together these communist parties now that are in power across much of Central and Eastern Europe. So there's still active support, mostly monetary, of the various communist parties across Western Europe. And again, they're very large communist parties, very popular in France and Italy after the Second World War. And I think the Italian Communist Party was actually, for a while, a part of the governing coalition. So in many ways, again, this goes on. And it really only really ends with probably the best way to think about it as a speech by Mikhail Gorbachev, which he gave at the United Nations in December 1988, in which he said that you know, the age of ideological diplomacy is over. And so we can really sort of trace the end of the ideas of sort of global revolution by this point, obviously. In December 1988, Gorbachev has his hands full with glasnost, perestroika, reforming the Soviet Union, and so global revolution no longer really a preoccupation, but it very much remains there. And again, the idea that you know, there will be communist societies across the globe is only really dead by this point. It still goes on for a while. Yeah, very much so.
Just quick addition, Reed, of course, is one of 3 Americans buried in the Kremlin necropolis, by the way. 2 of them are very obscure labor figures, but Reed is by far the most outstanding. And you can, if you go, it's free. You can see where his name is chiseled out on the on the left side as you approach the Lenin Mausoleum. Okay, next. Let's see if we can get through all of them.
Hi, my name is Marida. I'm a junior at AU, major in history. So I have heard the word utopianist like a couple of times, and some of the speeches put extra effort in emphasizing how utopian the ambitions of the revolution were. And I want to focus on the Bolshevik Revolution, and I really want to ask what was really utopian about aspiring a revolution in Western Europe. Weren't there realistic chances of overthrowing governments in Germany and other countries? I'm talking about 1918 to 1919. Rosa Luxemburg wrote in November, German imperialism is the thorn to the flesh of the Russian Revolution. So having in mind that the people who created the revolution put so much faith that the Russian Revolution would spark like a European wave, the very least. Why do we approach the 19th century revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, as a successful one? It was a failure because it failed to be a global revolution. And I don't understand why there is not a greater acknowledgement that Lenin and the rest were working on the premise that the revolution essentially failed.
Excellent question.
The great thing about ideologies is that they are much better at describing the future than the present. And it was maintained, even though that sort of ideological fervor or even belief had faded in vast portions of even the Soviet nomenclatura by the 1960s, there is still this vision of a future. And ideology in this sense is more a vision of the future than a reflection of the present. And so it is possible to see that bright future even, and in some sense work toward it, right, with support for a revolution overseas, both ideological and financial, as Dr. Chertoff says, and to see that. So this is not the historian grading the revolution a success, only to say that it's explicable within the terms of an ideology to see that defeat, there's no such thing as a permanent defeat, or there seems to be no such thing as a permanent defeat. There are only setbacks along the way, along the inevitable path of history. This is true in very important ways for the Soviet Union for Soviet ideology that sees itself as reflecting a kind of a necessary path, that history will necessarily follow this path, and their job is to nudge it along, right? So if you believe that history will ultimately bring it about, then you are spared the problem of identifying it as a failure.
Very briefly, Bolsheviks referred to what happened in October 1917 during the first years of their power as Октябрьский переворот, or October coup d'etat. As coup d'etat, it was very successful, and they managed to keep power. As a revolution, it was, of course, a failure, and when they realized it is a failure, they started referring to it as a revolution, by the way.
All right, excellent. Next question. I think we'll get through all of them. We only have 2 more students. Excellent.
Yeah, just one more. Well, 2 of us. Good evening, and I'd like to, my name is Elena Keith with your Citizen Project. And first of all, I'd like to recognize distinguished members of the panel. Thank you. The discussion is incredibly interesting. And what the years of research and your curiosity and commitment is amazing, truly amazing. And the question is, did any of you do research on how the revolution was financed, and if there are traces and some evidence that money came to support Bolshevik revolution, as well as Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin, and the money came from major financial houses in London, Germany, and New York. Anyone did research on that? Thank you.
Well, a lot of the money came directly by way of the German Foreign Office, of course, which organized the famous sealed train, which wasn't sealed, which basically transported Lenin and other revolutionaries from Zurich, where, of course, he was holed up during most of the First World War, Switzerland being neutral, through Germany, then by way of Sweden, neutral Sweden, into Petrograd. And the German Foreign Office did this specifically because they wanted to foment revolution, not just in Russia, but across the global empires of Britain and France. So they were financing Egyptian nationalists, Indian nationalists. They were trying to smuggle rifles into Ireland and sponsor the Easter Rebellion in 1916. And they saw, Arthur Zimmermann is the name of the Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs, who was very keen on this project, to basically shatter the coalition. And so he thought that, the Bolsheviks would foment unrest within Russia and ultimately knock it out of the war. Now, that did turn out to be the case, but of course, certainly the Germans got more than they bargained for, in other words. But yeah, they did pay substantial sums, even after Lenin arrived into Petrograd. So a lot of the money did come from the Germans as part of this grand strategy of how to win the war against overwhelming odds.
Yeah, let me just quickly add that some of you may know that there has been, a debate about whether Lenin was a German agent. And the answer to that question really depends on the time span that you're looking at. Short term, Borislav's absolutely right. Zimmermann got exactly what the Germans wanted. They fomented chaos in Russia and then knocked it out. But to argue that Lenin was doing German bidding by 1918-19, you have to really not know much about the Bolsheviks, because they were going after the German government and then the French if they could, and the American ultimate. I mean, they wanted global revolution. So, but yeah, a lot of the money came from Germany. All right, we are doing great on time. Thank you for your question. And the last question then, and we'll close up with that.
Yes, my name is Hayden Poitras, and I'm from George Mason. But my question is really for Dr. Wood. Is it fair, really, to compare the Russian women's industrial movement to our own here in America, such as Rosie the Riveter, even slightly? And simply, why do you think the Soviets and the communists were more ahead of the West in such liberalizing such laws, like you mentioned, like abortion, homosexuality, and even just equality?
Well, a lot of it had to do with Marxism. Friedrich Engels had written on this. Lenin, I'm convinced, was very influenced by his wife, Krupskaya, who had written in 1899 on the position of women. I think that they were committed to a socialist state where equality of all. I think they also profoundly didn't want difference. We can see it over and over again. They wanted to get rid of the feminist movements, so I wouldn't call them feminists. They wanted to get rid of anything that smacked of different rules. And some of this was profoundly liberatory. They got rid of the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews had been, isolated for the last 300 years. They're moving towards seeing an emancipatory goal, but it's also very much a demonstration project. They want to show the rest of the world that they're the ones who are ahead. And what's interesting is, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but I imagine my colleagues know more about this, is also the long-term role then of also criticizing the U.S. for race politics, for, then some of my colleagues have argued that this had a demonstration effect on helping to create the welfare state in the West. So we wouldn't have a revolution. So it's kind of interesting to see how this all plays out. I wouldn't say that they're entirely noble in their goals. I mean, I think they also wanted to use women as labor. They wanted women to be freed from the burdens of constant child care, so abortion was very convenient for them. It's working on many levels, but.
Well, there are a number of progressive American women who came to Moscow in the 1920s excited about the prospects of the Soviet model, right? Especially around questions of social welfare in particular. And so there is this sort of traffic in a vision that is people from other countries coming and seeing what they could find to inspire them, which also had its own after effect. I remember quite distinctly when working on my dissertation, finding an anti-Soviet book from 1932 that had a picture of Russian women working as ditch diggers in Moscow with the babushki and the shovels going, and the caption is, "Russian women freed of the drudgery of housework."
A great, a great resource, by the way, for this question is David's book, Modernization from the Other Shore, which goes into detail about the Western, foreign reactions to the Soviet Union.
Julia Mickenberg's is a better book, American.
Oh, yes, I was going to also ask if you would say the same for like the Stakhanovite movement, if you could compare that in any sense.
I think the sort of the Western and particularly American enthusiasms for Soviet projects had faded from non-communists, non-leftists by the end of the 1920s.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll close it at that. Thank you very much for coming.